January 10th, 49 BCE. A single river, one decision, and the fate of the Roman Republic hanging in the balance. This is the story of the general who gambled everything, invaded his own country, and changed the course of human history forever. A story of ambition and betrayal, of loyalty and treason, of a man who became a god and a republic that became an empire. The Rubicon River. Today, if you visit the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy, you'll find a modest stream, barely 20 feet wide in most places, shallow enough to wade across without getting your chest wet. Children play in it during summer. Farmers use it to water their fields. It seems impossibly ordinary, utterly unremarkable. But 2,000 years ago, this shallow waterway marked something far more significant than a geographical boundary. It was the sacred border of Italy itself, the line that separated the Roman heartland from the province of Cisalpine Gaul. It was the line between peace and war, between loyalty and treason, between civilization and barbarism, between life and death. Roman law, ancient and absolute, declared that no general could bring an army across this river. The boundary was both physical and metaphysical, a threshold written into the very foundation of the Republic. To cross it with armed forces was to break the most sacred covenant between Rome and its military commanders. The penalty was unambiguous: death. Not merely execution, but damnatio memoriae, the complete erasure of your name from history, as if you had never existed. Gaius Julius Caesar stood on the northern bank, his legion waiting behind him in the winter darkness. At 52 years old, he was entering what Romans considered old age, yet he had never been more powerful or more dangerous. His body bore the scars of 25 years of warfare, a wound from pirates in his youth, battle scars from Spain, the marks of combat in Gaul. But his mind was as sharp as ever, calculating, weighing, planning. He had spent the last 9 years conquering Gaul, an achievement that still seems almost impossible when you consider the scale. He had commanded legions across territory that today encompasses France, Belgium, Switzerland, and parts of Germany and the Netherlands. He had defeated over 300 tribes, some of whose names are now lost to history. The Helvetii, the Belgae, the Nervii, the Veneti. Millions had died in his campaigns. Millions more had been enslaved. The wealth he brought back to Rome was staggering, almost beyond comprehension. Gold by the ton, silver in quantities that destabilized the Roman economy, slaves in numbers that changed the demographic composition of Italy itself. One ancient historian estimated that Caesar enslaved 1 million Gauls. Modern scholars debate the exact number, but no one doubts it was catastrophic. His military achievements were equally extraordinary. He had crossed the Rhine, building a bridge across that mighty river in just 10 days, a feat of engineering that astonished the ancient world. He had invaded Britain twice, crossing the ocean that Romans called the edge of the world, bringing Roman standards to an island shrouded in mystery and myth. His legions worshipped him. He knew every centurion by name. He shared their dangers, slept in their camps, ate their food. When supplies ran short, he went hungry with them. When they marched, he marched. When they fought, he was there in the thick of battle, not commanding from a safe distance like other generals, but in the front lines where death could find him as easily as any common soldier. He was generous with plunder, distributing the wealth of Gaul to his men with an open hand. A common legionary in Caesar's army could retire wealthy. A centurion could buy a farm. A legate could enter the Senate. Caesar understood that loyalty was purchased not with words but with gold and glory and the promise of more to come. But now the Senate wanted to destroy him. They demanded he disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, stripped of his imperium, the legal authority that protected him from prosecution. They wanted him to walk into the city alone, vulnerable, defenseless. And then his enemies would pounce. Marcus Porcius Cato, the stern moralist who never forgave and never forgot. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the greatest orator of the age, who could destroy a man's reputation with words alone. And Pompey the Great, once his ally, now his rival, commanding the military might of the state. His hand rested on his sword. The water of the Rubicon flowed cold and dark before him. Roman law was clear and absolute. No general could cross this river with an army. To do so was to declare war on Rome itself. The penalty was death. Behind him, the 13th Legion stood silent. 4,800 men who had followed him through the frozen forests of Germania, across the stormy waters of the English Channel, and into the heart of Gaul. They had sworn an oath to Rome, but they were Caesar's men. Caesar knew what awaited him in Rome: exile at best, execution at worst. But there were fates worse than death for a Roman aristocrat: public humiliation, the confiscation of property, the disgrace of his family name, the destruction of everything he had built. His enemies had prepared their prosecution carefully, gathering testimony, collecting evidence, building a legal case that would be impossible to defeat in courts they controlled. His hand rested on his sword, a gladius forged in Spain, its blade bearing the nicks and scratches of 100 battles. The water of the Rubicon flowed cold and dark before him, reflecting the winter stars. The sound of it was deceptively peaceful, a gentle gurgling that belied the momentous decision it represented. Roman law was clear and absolute, carved into tradition more binding than any written statute. No general could cross this river with an army. To do so was to declare war on Rome itself. To do so was to become an enemy of the state, a traitor to everything Rome stood for. The penalty was death, and not a clean death in battle, but the shameful execution reserved for traitors. Behind him, the 13th Legion stood silent in the darkness. 4,800 men arranged in perfect ranks despite the late hour and the cold. You could hear the creak of leather, the soft clink of metal, the breathing of thousands of soldiers waiting for their commander's decision. These men had followed him through the frozen forests of Germania, where the trees grew so thick that sunlight never reached the ground. They had crossed the stormy waters of the English Channel, many of them vomiting from seasickness but still ready to fight when they reached the British shore. They had marched into the heart of Gaul, into lands where no Roman army had ever ventured, and they had conquered it all. They had sworn an oath to Rome, the sacramentum, the most sacred vow a Roman soldier could take. They had pledged to obey the Senate and people of Rome, to defend the Republic against all enemies foreign and domestic, to never desert their standards or abandon their comrades. That oath was witnessed by the gods themselves, and to break it was to invite divine punishment not just in this life, but in the afterlife as well. But they were Caesar's men. He had trained them, led them, bled with them. They had shared 9 years of campaigning together, 9 years of victories and hardships that forged bonds stronger than any legal obligation. When Caesar spoke, they listened. When Caesar commanded, they obeyed. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, they would follow. The question was whether Caesar would give that command. Caesar's mind raced through the alternatives with the same tactical brilliance he brought to battlefield decisions. He could disband the legion right here, right now. He could order his men to return to their homes, to their farms and families. He could walk into Rome alone, dressed in a simple toga, without weapons or guards, and face trial as a private citizen. It would be the honorable thing to do, the act of a true Roman who respected the law above personal safety. But his enemies controlled the courts. Marcus Porcius Cato, called Cato the Younger to distinguish him from his famous great-grandfather, had spent years positioning his allies in key judicial positions. Cato was a Stoic philosopher, a man of rigid principle who saw the world in absolute terms of right and wrong. To Cato, Caesar was wrong, a demagogue who corrupted the Republic with lavish bribes and military glory. Cato would prosecute Caesar personally if given the chance, and he would never accept a compromise or a plea bargain. It would be total victory or nothing. Pompey the Great, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, once his ally and son-in-law, now commanded the Senate's armies. Pompey, who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in just 3 months, accomplishing in weeks what others failed to do in years. Pompey, who had conquered the East, defeated King Mithridates, reorganized half the known world, and returned to Rome with a triumph so magnificent that it lasted 2 full days. Pompey, whose military genius was legendary, whose political influence was immense, and whose pride would never allow Caesar to eclipse him. The trial would be a foregone conclusion. Caesar would be convicted, his property confiscated, his name disgraced. If he was lucky, they would offer him exile. He could live out his days in some provincial town, far from Rome, forbidden to ever return, watching his achievements be credited to others, his conquests celebrated as Rome's victories rather than his own. For a man of Caesar's ambition, for someone who claimed descent from Venus herself, and from Aeneas the Trojan hero, this was a fate worse than death. Or he could retreat north, perhaps back to Gaul, and live as a provincial governor, administering the territories he had conquered, but never again participating in the great game of Roman politics. He could watch from a distance as his enemies dismantled his political coalition, as the popular reforms he championed were reversed, as the common people who adored him were crushed once more under aristocratic rule. His legions would be reassigned to other commanders. His veterans would be denied the land grants he had promised them. His clients and supporters in Rome would be purged from public life. Everything he had worked for would be undone, as if he had never existed. For a man who claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, who had conquered more territory than any living Roman, who had brought more wealth into the treasury than anyone since Pompey's eastern campaigns, this was unthinkable. Caesar had not spent 9 years in Gaul, had not risked his life 1,000 times, had not sacrificed his youth and health to end his career in obscurity and disgrace. The third option was madness: cross the Rubicon with his army, march on Rome, the eternal city, the capital of the Republic, the sacred heart of Roman civilization, become an enemy of the state, a rebel, a traitor, start a civil war that would tear the Republic apart, that would pit Roman against Roman, that would drench Italy in blood. This was not conquest of barbarians in distant lands, not warfare against foreign enemies. This was Roman killing Roman. This was the ultimate crime, the violation that could never be forgiven, never be forgotten, never be undone. Civil war had happened before in Roman history, and the memory still haunted the Republic. 40 years earlier, Lucius Cornelius Sulla had marched on Rome with his legions, the first general in Roman history to do so. Sulla had fought his way into the city, killed his political enemies, and made himself dictator. Then he had instituted the proscriptions, posting lists of enemies to be killed for their property, unleashing a reign of terror that left thousands dead and traumatized a generation. Caesar remembered Sulla's dictatorship. He had been a young man then, marked for death because of his family connections to Sulla's enemies. He had fled Rome, hiding in the countryside, living as a fugitive until friends interceded to save his life. Sulla had pardoned him reluctantly, reportedly saying in that young man, "I see many Mariuses," referring to Gaius Marius, Sulla's great enemy and one of Rome's bloodiest civil war leaders. The Romans had sworn after Sulla that they would never allow another general to march on the city. They had reformed their laws, restructured their institutions, built safeguards to prevent another military strongman from seizing power. And now Caesar was contemplating doing exactly what Sulla had done, breaking the exact same laws, crossing the exact same red lines. But Caesar told himself his situation was different. He was not seeking power for its own sake. He was defending himself against an unjust persecution. He was protecting his soldiers, who deserved the land and rewards he had promised them. He was championing the common people of Rome against an oligarchic senate that cared only for its own privileges. But Caesar was not a man who accepted defeat, not in warfare and not in politics. His entire life had been a story of overcoming impossible odds through audacity, intelligence, and sheer force of will. He had survived capture by pirates in his youth, an experience that would have broken lesser men. The pirates had demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, a substantial sum. Caesar had laughed in their faces and insisted they ask for 50, insulted that they had valued him so cheaply. While waiting for the ransom to arrive, he had treated his captors with amused contempt, ordering them to be quiet when he wanted to sleep, participating in their games and exercises, writing poetry and making speeches which he forced them to listen to, calling them illiterate barbarians when they failed to appreciate his genius. When the ransom finally arrived and Caesar was released, he did not simply sail away grateful to be alive. Instead, he immediately raised a fleet, hunted down the pirates, captured them all, and had them crucified, though he mercifully had their throats cut first before the crucifixion because they had treated him well during his captivity. It was a perfect demonstration of Caesar's character, charming, ruthless, theatrical, and absolutely unwilling to let an insult or a wrong go unpunished. He had risen through Roman politics despite being born into a patrician family with little money, a serious disadvantage in a system where wealth often determined political success. The Julian clan was ancient and noble, tracing its ancestry back to Iulus, the son of Aeneas, the Trojan hero who founded the Roman race. According to family legend, this meant the Julii were descended from Venus herself. But ancient lineage didn't pay for the bribes, the games, the public works, and the political favors that greased the wheels of Roman politics. Caesar had made himself indispensable through a combination of political skill, military success, and massive borrowing. He had allied himself with Pompey and Crassus in the secret political arrangement that modern historians call the First Triumvirate, though the Romans had no such term for it. Together, the three most powerful men in Rome had carved up the Republic among themselves, arranging elections, distributing offices, and ensuring that their interests were protected. Crassus provided the money. He was the richest man in Rome, having made his fortune through silver mines, slave trading, and a particularly notorious scheme of buying burning buildings at fire sale prices, and then putting out the fires with his private fire brigade. Pompey provided military glory and political connections. He was the most celebrated general of the age, the conqueror of the East, the man who had triumphed 3 times. Caesar provided the political talent and the support of the common people. The wealth of Gaul had made Caesar the richest man in Rome, surpassing even Crassus. His military victories had made him the most celebrated general since Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal. His soldiers loved him because he shared the dangers of battle, slept in the same camps, endured the same hardships, and rewarded them generously with plunder. A common legionary in Caesar's army could save enough from his share of the loot to buy a small farm when he retired. A centurion could become wealthy. A legate could enter the Senate as a rich man. The common people of Rome adored him with an intensity that alarmed the Senate. He had given them grain during famines, not just small amounts but massive distributions that kept Roman families fed when the traditional grain supply failed. He had sponsored magnificent gladiatorial games, spectacles of such extravagance that they were talked about for years afterward. Hundreds of gladiators fighting in elaborate staged battles. Exotic animals from Africa paraded through the streets. Theatrical performances on a scale never seen before. Mock naval battles staged in flooded arenas. The people loved it, and they loved Caesar for giving it to them. He had promised land for veterans, understanding that soldiers who had served Rome for decades deserved more than a small discharge bonus and a return to poverty. He advocated for debt relief for struggling citizens, knowing that many Romans were trapped in cycles of borrowing that they could never escape. His faction, the populars, championed the rights of ordinary citizens against the aristocratic elite, and Caesar had become the populars' most charismatic and effective leader. But the Senate feared him. They saw a man who commanded absolute loyalty from his troops, who had the wealth to bribe anyone, and who showed disturbing disregard for traditional authority. They remembered Sulla, who had marched on Rome 40 years earlier and made himself dictator. The Senate's fear had turned to action. They had passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree, which effectively declared martial law and authorized the consuls to use any means necessary to defend the state against Caesar. Pompey the Great once Caesar's son-in-law and political partner, had been given command of all forces in Italy. Pompey, who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, conquered the East and reorganized half the known world. Pompey, who now stood with the Senate against Caesar. The Optimates, the conservative faction in the Senate, believed they were saving the Republic from a tyrant. They saw Caesar as a demagogue who manipulated the mob, a general who had exceeded his authority, a politician who broke every rule to advance his career. They were not entirely wrong. Caesar had exceeded his governorship in Gaul to wage wars of conquest. He had intervened in Roman politics from abroad, using his wealth to influence elections. He had formed the secret alliance with Pompey and Crassus that historians would call the First Triumvirate, carving up power among themselves. But Caesar saw himself differently. He was a champion of the people against a corrupt oligarchy. The Senate was filled with men who had grown rich exploiting the provinces, who manipulated the law to maintain their power, who cared nothing for the suffering of ordinary Romans. The Senate had betrayed him first, Caesar told himself. They had refused to let him stand for consul in absentia, a request that would have allowed him to transition directly from military command to civilian office without the gap that left him vulnerable to prosecution. They had rejected every compromise. When Caesar offered to disband most of his legions and keep only 2, they refused. When he offered to meet Pompey for direct negotiations, they blocked it. They wanted his complete surrender, knowing it meant his destruction. As Caesar stood by the Rubicon, messengers kept arriving with news from Rome. The Senate had declared him a public enemy if he did not disband his army by a certain date. That date had passed. His allies in Rome, the tribunes Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, had been forced to flee the city in disguise. The violation of tribune sacrosanctity was, to Caesar, the final proof of the Senate's tyranny. The tribunes were meant to be inviolable, protected by ancient law and religious custom. By threatening them, the Senate had broken the very constitutional order they claimed to defend. Caesar called his officers together. The legates stood in a circle around him, their breath visible in the cold night air. These were the men who had conquered Gaul with him. Labienus, his second in command, who had won victories in his name. Antonius, young and ambitious, who had just escaped from Rome. He told them everything. The Senate's ultimatum, the choice before them. If they crossed the Rubicon, there would be no turning back. They would be declared traitors, their property would be confiscated, their families would be at risk, and they would be fighting fellow Romans. But if they turned back, Caesar would be destroyed, and the Senate would never forget that these officers had served him. Their careers would be finished. They might face prosecution themselves for the wars in Gaul. The Senate's revenge would be thorough. The officers knew the stakes. This was not a decision about tactics or strategy. This was about loyalty. Did they follow Caesar into the abyss, or did they abandon him and hope for mercy from the Senate? One by one, they pledged to follow him. They had shared too much with Caesar to betray him now. The years in Gaul had forged bonds stronger than political allegiance. They were Caesar's men, and they would see this through to the end, wherever it led. But Caesar himself still hesitated. Ancient sources say he spent hours in agonized deliberation. He was not an impulsive man, despite his bold actions. Every major decision in his career had been carefully calculated, and this decision would echo through eternity. The Roman Republic was nearly 500 years old. It had survived wars with Carthage, invasions by Hannibal, civil conflicts between patricians and plebeians, and the slave rebellion of Spartacus. It had grown from a single city to an empire spanning the Mediterranean world. That republic had a constitution, unwritten but powerful. The Senate advised, the assemblies voted, the magistrates executed the law. No one man held supreme power. The Romans had expelled their last king 5 centuries earlier and had sworn never to bow to a monarch again. To cross the Rubicon with an army was to reject that entire system. It was to say that military might trump constitutional authority, that personal loyalty mattered more than civic duty, that the republic itself was broken beyond repair. Caesar knew that if he won the coming civil war, he could never fully restore the old order. The republic might survive in name, but its essence would be changed forever. Future generals would look to his example. The precedent would be set. But if he did nothing, the republic would continue in its corrupt state. The Senate would remain dominated by a small group of families who treated Rome as their private property. The common people would continue to suffer while the optimates grew richer. Nothing would change. Perhaps, Caesar thought, the republic was already dead. Perhaps it had died when Sulla marched on Rome, or when the triumvirate divided power among themselves, or when wealth from conquered territories corrupted the old virtues. Perhaps he was simply acknowledging reality. The night grew colder. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that Roman augurs read for omens about the future. Caesar, always superstitious, had consulted the gods before this moment. The signs had been ambiguous as they always were. According to the historian Suetonius, Caesar saw an apparition by the river. A figure of superhuman size appeared, seized a trumpet from one of the soldiers, crossed the river, and sounded the war call on the opposite bank. Whether this was divine intervention, a story invented later, or Caesar's own theatrical staging, we cannot know. What we do know is that Caesar made his decision. He spoke the words that would echo through history, words that have become a proverb in a dozen languages. Alia iacta est, the die is cast. And with those words, Caesar stepped into the Rubicon. The cold water reached his knees, then his waist. His purple general's cloak trailed behind him, his officers followed. Then the standard-bearers with the legion's eagle, then the centurions, then the common soldiers. 4,800 men crossed the Rubicon that January night. They violated Roman law. They became enemies of the state. They committed treason, and they followed Caesar toward Rome. The 13th Legion marched south through the darkness. They moved quickly, covering ground at the famous Roman pace that had conquered the known world. Caesar wanted speed. Surprise was his greatest advantage. The Senate did not yet know he had crossed. Word spread ahead of them. Civilians fled the roads. Small towns shut their gates in fear. The name of Caesar, celebrated in Rome for his victories in Gaul, now became a name of terror. An army was coming. Civil war had begun. Caesar's strategy was clear from the start. He would not behave like a foreign invader. There would be no looting, no violence against civilians, no destruction of property. His soldiers were under strict orders. This was not conquest. This was liberation. At every town, Caesar proclaimed his message. He was not rebelling against Rome. He was defending the Republic against a corrupt Senate. He came to restore the rights of the tribunes, to protect the people from oligarchic tyranny, to save Roman liberty itself. It was brilliant propaganda, and it worked. Town after town opened their gates to Caesar. Local magistrates, given the choice between the distant Senate and Caesar's army at their walls, chose survival. Italy had no stomach for a war to protect senatorial privileges. The Senate, meanwhile, was in chaos. News of Caesar's crossing reached Rome and triggered panic. Senators who had voted for Caesar's prosecution now fled the city. Wealthy families packed their valuables and headed south. Pompey, caught unprepared, had to admit he had no troops ready to defend the capital. Pompey's confidence had been his downfall. He had boasted that he had only to stamp his foot and legions would appear. But those legions were scattered across the empire. The troops in Italy were raw recruits, untrained and untested. Caesar's veterans could destroy them. So Pompey made a strategic decision. He would abandon Rome. He would retreat south to Brundisium, evacuate to Greece, and build his strength there. With control of the eastern provinces and their resources, He could raise a massive army and return to crush Caesar. It was a sound strategy militarily, but politically it was a disaster. When Pompey and the consuls fled Rome, it looked like cowardice. The Senate, Rome's supreme authority, was running away from one of its own generals. The symbolism was devastating. Caesar marched into Italy without fighting a battle. His clemency won him more support than violence ever could. When he captured enemy soldiers, he pardoned them. When he took enemy towns, he protected them. He was proving that he was not another Sulla, not a tyrant seeking revenge. At Corfinium, a senatorial commander named Domitius tried to make a stand with 30 cohorts. Caesar besieged the town, but before assaulting it, he offered terms. Surrender, and no one would be harmed. Domitius's own soldiers, seeing Caesar's clemency elsewhere, mutinied and handed their commander over. Caesar could have executed Domitius for treason. Instead, he released him unharmed. He released all the soldiers and let them choose whether to join him or go home. Most joined him. This was Caesar's genius. He was winning the civil war without creating the bitterness that would make lasting peace impossible. Within 60 days of crossing the Rubicon, Caesar had conquered all of Italy without a major battle. Pompey evacuated to Greece with much of the Senate. Rome itself stood undefended. The Republic's capital was Caesar's for the taking. On March 31, 49 BCE, Julius Caesar entered Rome. No foreign enemy had entered the city since the Gauls sacked it nearly 400 years earlier. But Caesar was not a foreigner. He was a Roman senator, a former consul, a patrician of ancient lineage. And yet, he came with an army. The city held its breath. Would Caesar enact proscriptions like Sulla, posting lists of enemies to be killed for their property? Would there be massacres in the streets? Would the temples be looted? Rome waited in terror. Instead, Caesar went to the Senate House and addressed the remaining senators. He spoke of reconciliation, of peace, of restoring constitutional government. He blamed the crisis on a few stubborn optimates who had forced his hand. He offered amnesty to anyone who would accept it. It was a masterful performance. Caesar presented himself not as a conqueror but as a reluctant savior. He had crossed the Rubicon not from ambition but from necessity. He had no choice but to defend himself. Now that he had secured his safety, he wanted only to restore normal government. But beneath the rhetoric, the reality was clear. Caesar had an army in Rome. His soldiers controlled the streets. His will was law, regardless of what the Senate technically decided. The Republic's institutions continued to function, but they functioned at Caesar's pleasure. Caesar needed legitimacy. Military force had brought him to Rome, but force alone could not sustain his power. He needed the appearance of constitutional authority. So he had himself appointed dictator, an ancient emergency office that gave him supreme power legally. The dictatorship was meant to be temporary, used only in extreme crises and lasting no more than 6 months. Caesar used it to stabilize the situation, pass some popular laws, and then resigned it. He had himself elected consul for 48 BCE, giving him power through legal channels. With Rome secured, Caesar turned his attention to the wider war. Pompey was in Greece, raising an enormous army from the eastern provinces. The Senate in exile supported Pompey with all the resources of Rome's richest territories. Caesar needed to defeat them, or all his success in Italy would mean nothing. But first, he had to deal with Pompey's forces in Spain. Pompey had powerful legates commanding 7 legions in Hispania. If Caesar went east to fight Pompey, these legions could invade Italy from the west. Caesar needed to neutralize this threat. In a lightning campaign, Caesar marched to Spain, outmaneuvered Pompey's forces, and forced them to surrender without a major battle. Once again, his clemency shocked the Roman world. He pardoned the enemy soldiers, incorporated them into his army, and returned to Rome having secured the western provinces. Now came the decisive campaign. Caesar gathered his forces and prepared to cross the Adriatic Sea to Greece, where Pompey waited with an army that outnumbered Caesar's forces 2-1. Pompey had cavalry, supplies, and the backing of Rome's eastern allies. Caesar had veteran legions and audacity. The crossing of the Adriatic in winter was as risky as crossing the Rubicon had been. Caesar gambled that Pompey would not expect an attack in the storming season. He loaded his troops onto ships and sailed into dangerous waters, evading Pompey's superior naval forces through speed and surprise. Caesar landed in Greece with only part of his army. The rest, under Mark Antony, was delayed by bad weather and Pompey's ships. For weeks, Caesar was stranded with insufficient forces, vulnerable to being crushed by Pompey's vastly larger army. But Pompey hesitated. The same caution that had made him abandon Rome now made him reluctant to attack. He had the advantage in numbers, but he knew Caesar's veterans were superior fighters. He decided to wait, to let Caesar's supply problems weaken him, to let time do the work. Caesar, meanwhile, used every trick in his repertoire. He tried to provoke Pompey into battle. He attempted to cut off Pompey's supplies. He sent messages offering negotiation, knowing Pompey would refuse but hoping to seem reasonable to observers. When Mark Antony finally arrived with the rest of Caesar's army, the situation stabilized. Caesar now had enough troops to be dangerous. Pompey still had numerical superiority, but the gap had narrowed. The two armies maneuvered across Greece, looking for advantage. At Dyrrhachium, Pompey trapped part of Caesar's army and inflicted a serious defeat. Caesar's forces suffered heavy casualties and had to retreat. For the first time since crossing the Rubicon, Caesar had lost. Pompey's supporters were jubilant. The war seemed to be turning. But Pompey again failed to press his advantage. Instead of pursuing Caesar's weakened army and destroying it, he let Caesar retreat and regroup. Pompey believed he had won the war strategically. Caesar was isolated, low on supplies, and had nowhere to go. It was only a matter of time. Caesar, however, saw opportunity in desperation. He retreated into Thessaly, drawing Pompey away from his supply bases on the coast. Pompey followed, confident that he was hunting a wounded animal. The two armies converged on the plains of Pharsalus. On August 9, 48 BCE, the decisive battle finally came on the plains of Pharsalus in central Greece. It was a hot summer day, the kind where the sun beats down mercilessly on armored men, where heat exhaustion kills as surely as swords. The two armies faced each other across open ground, and every soldier on both sides knew that this battle would decide the fate of Rome. Pompey had 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, an enormous force assembled from across the eastern Mediterranean. His legions included Romans, Italians, Greeks, Thracians, and soldiers from a dozen other nations. His cavalry was composed largely of aristocratic Romans and their clients, men who could afford horses and expensive equipment, men who had everything to lose if Caesar won. Caesar had 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, outnumbered more than 2-1. But his legions were veterans, men who had fought in Gaul for years, who had faced Germanic warriors and British chariots, who had learned to trust each other and their commander completely. These men had been in desperate situations before and had always found a way to win. Pompey's battle plan relied on his superior cavalry, and it was a sound strategy based on traditional Roman tactics. He positioned his infantry in the center in 3 lines, the standard Roman formation. His cavalry, 7,000 strong, he placed on his left wing, facing Caesar's right flank. The plan was straightforward. The cavalry would charge around Caesar's flank, attack his army from behind, and crush Caesar's smaller force in a pincer movement between the cavalry and the infantry. It should have worked. Pompey had every advantage: numbers, position, cavalry superiority. His soldiers were fresh, well-supplied, and confident. Many of them believed the war was essentially over, that this battle was just a formality before Caesar's inevitable surrender. Some of Pompey's officers were already arguing about who would get Caesar's house in Rome after he was dead. But Caesar was not a conventional commander, and he had not survived 9 years of warfare in Gaul by following conventional tactics. He had studied Pompey's strategy, analyzed how Pompey had won his previous battles, understood how Pompey thought, and he had devised a counter that would change the course of military history. Caesar positioned his legions in 3 lines as well, matching Pompey's formation. But secretly, quietly, he took cohorts from his 3rd line and created a 4th line, a hidden reserve positioned behind his cavalry on the right flank. These troops were given special instructions. They were to hold their position, stay hidden behind the cavalry, and wait for Caesar's signal. And crucially, Caesar gave them different weapons instructions. Normally, Roman legionaries would throw their javelins at the enemy and then draw swords for close combat. But Caesar ordered this 4th line to keep their javelins and use them as thrusting spears, aimed specifically at the faces and eyes of enemy cavalry. He knew that aristocratic cavalrymen, vain about their appearances, would panic if they faced disfiguring facial wounds. He knew that horses would rear and bolt if stabbed at close range, rather than hit by thrown missiles. When the battle began, everything went according to Pompey's plan at first. The 2 infantry lines clashed in the center with the sound of metal on metal, shields slamming into shields, thousands of men pushing and stabbing in the brutal, exhausting work of hand-to-hand combat. Caesar's veterans held their ground despite being outnumbered, but they could not advance against Pompey's superior numbers. Then Pompey unleashed his cavalry. 7,000 horsemen charged around Caesar's right flank, easily overwhelming Caesar's outnumbered cavalry, driving them back in apparent panic. The moment of victory seemed to have arrived. Pompey's cavalry wheeled to attack Caesar's legions from behind, ready to deliver the crushing blow that would end the battle and the war. But then Caesar's hidden 4th line emerged from behind the fleeing cavalry. 6 cohorts, about 3,000 men, suddenly appeared in perfect formation, javelins held like spears, advancing in disciplined ranks directly at the charging cavalry. The effect was devastating and immediate. As the cavalry thundered forward, expecting easy targets, they instead found themselves facing a wall of spear points aimed at their faces. The front ranks of horses, stabbed in the chest and neck at close range, reared and screamed, throwing their riders, creating chaos. The cavalrymen behind, unable to stop their momentum, crashed into the mass of panicked horses and fallen riders. And then the real horror began for Pompey's aristocratic cavalry. Caesar's soldiers, following their orders precisely, thrust their javelins upward at the faces and eyes of the horsemen. Ancient accounts describe cavalrymen raising their hands to protect their faces, abandoning their weapons, turning their horses to flee. These were not professional soldiers accustomed to brutal close-quarters combat. These were wealthy Romans, senators' sons, men who fought from horseback because it was glorious, not because they were prepared to have their faces slashed open by common soldiers. The cavalry broke. 7,000 horsemen, the pride of Pompey's army, fled the battlefield in panic. In minutes, Pompey's overwhelming advantage had vanished. Without cavalry support, Pompey's left flank was now exposed and vulnerable. Caesar's hidden line, having routed the cavalry, now wheeled to attack Pompey's infantry from the side. Caesar, watching from his command position, saw the moment of crisis for Pompey's army. He immediately committed his 3rd line, his final reserve, throwing his full weight into the battle. His veterans, sensing victory, pushed forward with renewed energy. Pompey's army, seeing their cavalry routed and now facing attack from multiple directions, began to waver. Pompey's army, despite its numbers, began to collapse. The infantry, seeing their cavalry routed, lost confidence. Caesar's hardened legions, veterans of Gaul, pushed relentlessly forward. The battle turned into a massacre. Pompey himself, watching his army disintegrate, reportedly said, "Even in my camp," and then fled the battlefield. The great general who had conquered the East and reformed Rome's military ran away while his soldiers died. His nerve had broken completely. Caesar's victory at Pharsalus was total. 15,000 of Pompey's soldiers died. 24,000 surrendered. Caesar's casualties were minimal, perhaps 200 dead. In one afternoon, the war's outcome had been decided. Caesar, as always, offered clemency to the survivors. He pardoned enemy soldiers and released them. He even pardoned many of the senatorial commanders who had fought against him, including Marcus Brutus, who would later assassinate him. Caesar's mercy was becoming legendary. But Pompey was gone, fleeing toward Egypt. Caesar pursued him, determined to end the civil war completely. Pompey still had his reputation, his connections, and his ability to raise new armies. As long as Pompey lived, resistance could continue. Pompey reached Egypt and asked King Ptolemy for sanctuary. Egypt owed Pompey a debt for his support of the previous king, but Ptolemy's advisors made a cold calculation. Pompey was a loser now. Caesar was the victor. Better to win Caesar's favor than shelter his enemy. As Pompey's boat approached the Egyptian shore, assassins sent by Ptolemy rowed out to meet him. Pompey was stabbed to death in front of his wife, his body dumped into the sea, his head cut off to present to Caesar as a gift. When Caesar arrived in Egypt and was presented with Pompey's severed head, he reportedly wept. Whether from genuine grief for his former ally and son-in-law, or from anger at being denied the chance to show clemency, we cannot know. But Caesar had Pompey's murderers executed. Caesar remained in Egypt, drawn into the complex politics of the Ptolemaic court. The young queen Cleopatra was in a power struggle with her brother-husband Ptolemy. Caesar sided with Cleopatra, partly from political calculation, partly from personal attraction. The Alexandrian War followed, with Caesar besieged in the palace quarter by Egyptian forces. It was a dangerous situation for the conqueror of Gaul, trapped in a foreign city with limited forces. But Caesar's luck held. Reinforcements arrived, and he defeated Ptolemy's army. Cleopatra became Caesar's lover and bore him a son, Caesarion. Caesar spent months in Egypt, longer than military necessity required. His enemies said he was behaving like a king in all but name, dallying with an oriental queen while Rome waited. But Rome was secure. Caesar's lieutenants held Italy and the western provinces. The remnants of Pompey's faction had scattered. Some fled to Africa, where they rallied around Cato and Scipio. Others went to Spain, but they were fragments of a defeated movement. Caesar returned to Rome in triumph. The Senate, now mostly composed of his supporters or intimidated neutrals, voted him unprecedented honors. He was made dictator again, this time for a year. Statues were erected in his honor. His birthday became a public holiday. Yet the war was not quite finished. In Africa, Cato and Metellus Scipio had assembled 10 legions, bolstered by King Juba of Numidia's forces. They represented the last hope of the Optimates, the final stand of the old republic. Caesar sailed to Africa in late 47 BCE and began his final campaign. The Battle of Thapsus in 46 BCE was another crushing victory. Scipio's army was annihilated. Juba killed himself. Cato, besieged in Utica and knowing Caesar would pardon him, chose suicide rather than accept clemency from the man who had destroyed the republic. Cato's death made him a martyr. Caesar's enemies could point to the last true Roman who chose death over tyranny. But Caesar's supporters argued that Cato's inflexibility had helped cause the civil war. If the Optimates had compromised, none of this would have been necessary. A final mop-up campaign in Spain dealt with Pompey's sons, who had raised another army. At Munda in 45 BCE, Caesar won his hardest battle, nearly losing before his veterans' discipline won the day. Pompey's older son was killed. The younger escaped but would cause no more trouble. After 5 years of civil war, it was over. Caesar had invaded his own country and won. He had defeated Pompey, conquered Egypt, subdued Africa, and pacified Spain. He had fought fellow Romans across the Mediterranean world and emerged victorious. Caesar returned to Rome as undisputed master of the Roman world. The Senate, now mostly composed of his supporters or intimidated neutrals, voted him dictator for 10 years, an unprecedented length for an office that was supposed to be temporary. Later they would make it perpetual, dictator for life, a title that made him effectively a king in all but name. He held powers that no Roman had held since the last kings were expelled 5 centuries before, powers that violated every principle the Republic was founded upon. But Caesar used that power to transform Rome in ways that would last for centuries, reforms that addressed real problems the Senate had refused to fix for generations. He reformed the calendar, replacing the chaotic lunar calendar that Rome had used for centuries with a solar calendar based on Egyptian models. The old calendar had become so out of sync with the seasons that winter months occurred in autumn. Caesar's new Julian calendar had 365 days, with an extra day every 4 years, a system so elegant and practical that it would be used for over 1,500 years. Our modern calendar is still based on Caesar's design, and July is named for Julius Caesar himself. He settled his veterans in colonies across the empire, not just in Italy but in Gaul, Spain, North Africa, and the East. Over 100,000 veteran soldiers received land, fulfilling the promises he had made them and creating Roman communities that would spread Latin language and culture across the Mediterranean world. These colonies became centers of commerce, administration, and Roman civilization in regions that had previously been provincial backwaters. He expanded the Senate from 600 members to 900, bringing in representatives from the provinces, men from Gaul and Spain who had never dreamed they could sit in the Supreme Council of Rome. The traditional senators were horrified, calling these new members barbarians and claiming Caesar was degrading the dignity of the Senate. But Caesar understood that the empire was too large to be governed solely by Roman and Italian aristocrats. The provinces needed representation, and the Senate needed fresh perspectives. He planned vast public works that would make Rome the most magnificent city in the world. New forums, new temples, a massive new basilica, a library to rival the Great Library of Alexandria. He wanted to drain the Pontine marshes, improving public health and creating new agricultural land. He planned to dig a canal across the Isthmus of Corinth, connecting the Aegean and Ionian seas. He envisioned redirecting the Tiber River to prevent the floods that periodically devastated Rome. He proposed land reforms to help the poor, limiting the number of slaves wealthy landowners could use and requiring that at least 1/3 of agricultural workers be free citizens. This would create jobs for poor Romans while reducing the dangerous concentration of slaves that had led to rebellions like Spartacus's uprising. The wealthy landowners hated this proposal, but the common people loved it. He granted citizenship to more people in the provinces, understanding that Roman citizenship was the glue that held the empire together. People who had Roman citizenship felt loyalty to Rome, paid Roman taxes willingly, and defended Roman interests. Caesar granted citizenship to doctors, teachers, and other professionals in Rome, recognizing their contributions to society regardless of their origins. He reformed the grain dole, the system that provided free grain to Roman citizens, making it more efficient and less corrupt while ensuring that those who truly needed it received support. He reformed the courts, reducing corruption and making justice more accessible to ordinary citizens. He passed laws against luxury, trying to curb the extravagant spending of the wealthy, though these laws were largely ignored. In many ways, his vision was progressive, looking beyond the narrow interests of the Roman aristocracy to the needs of the empire as a whole. He saw that Rome could not continue to be governed by a small clique of noble families treating the provinces as their personal property. He understood that the common people deserved better than to be pawns in aristocratic power struggles. He believed that talent and ability mattered more than birth and lineage. But he also made mistakes that would cost him his life, errors of judgment that arose from his success and his power. He accepted divine honors that made him seem more than human, allowing temples to be built in his honor, accepting the title of divus, divine. Statues of Caesar appeared throughout Rome and the provinces, often showing him in heroic poses, sometimes depicting him with the attributes of gods. For Romans who had rejected monarchy and divine rulership, this was deeply disturbing. He refused to rise when the Senate entered his presence, a breach of protocol that seemed to show contempt for the institution that had governed Rome for centuries. Whether this was due to a medical condition, as some claimed, or simple arrogance, as others believed, it enraged senators who saw it as proof that Caesar thought himself above them. He spoke openly of staying in power permanently, making it clear that the republic would not return to its old form. When reminded that the dictatorship was supposed to be temporary, he would smile and change the subject. When asked when he would resign, he would talk about all the reforms that still needed to be completed. It became clear to everyone that Caesar intended to rule for life and perhaps pass his power to an heir. He began planning an enormous military campaign against Parthia, the Eastern Empire that had defeated and killed Crassus years earlier. He wanted to avenge that defeat, to conquer new territories, to match Alexander the Great's achievements. 18 legions were being assembled, supplies gathered, plans made. Caesar would leave for the east in the spring, and who knew when or if he would return. Some said he planned to move the capital to Alexandria or Babylon, abandoning Rome for a more central location in the empire. Others said he wanted to marry Cleopatra and create a dynasty combining Roman military might with Egyptian wealth and Hellenistic culture. These rumors, whether true or false, terrified the Roman aristocracy who saw their world slipping away. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, March 15th on our calendar, 60 conspirators surrounded Caesar in the Senate House and stabbed him to death. It was a coordinated assassination that had been planned for months, involving some of the most prominent men in Rome, men who believed they were saving the Republic from tyranny. The conspiracy had begun in secret meetings, whispered conversations in the darkness, coded messages passed between trusted allies. The leaders were Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Both men Caesar had pardoned after they fought for Pompey at Pharsalus. Brutus was especially significant because he was rumored to be Caesar's illegitimate son from Caesar's long affair with Brutus's mother, Servilia. Caesar had certainly treated Brutus with special favor, promoting him, trusting him, even nomming him in his will as a secondary heir. The conspirators called themselves the Liberators, claiming they were freeing Rome from a tyrant just as Brutus's ancestor had expelled the last king 500 years earlier. They painted their cause in the language of liberty, republicanism, and constitutional government. They saw themselves as heroes performing a patriotic duty, willing to commit murder to save Rome from monarchical rule. That morning, Caesar almost didn't go to the Senate meeting. He had been warned by soothsayers that danger awaited him before the Ides of March passed. His wife Calpurnia had dreamed of his death, seeing his bloodied body in her arms, and she begged him not to go. Some said his health was failing, that he suffered from seizures and headaches. He was tired after years of warfare and political struggle. But Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators and one of Caesar's most trusted friends, came to his house and convinced him to attend. Decimus argued that the Senate was going to offer Caesar the crown, the formal title of king for territories outside Italy. To refuse this honor by not attending would be an insult. Caesar, always concerned with his dignity and his image, allowed himself to be persuaded. He left his house and walked to Pompey's theater, where the Senate was meeting that day. As he walked through the streets of Rome, a man named Artemidorus tried to hand him a letter detailing the conspiracy, nomming all the conspirators, warning him of the plot. But Caesar was surrounded by well-wishers and petitioners, all trying to get his attention, and he never read the letter. It was found in his hand after his death, unopened. When Caesar entered the Senate chamber, the conspirators were waiting, positioned strategically around the room. The meeting began normally, with routine business and speeches. Then a senator named Julius Caesar approached Caesar with a petition for his exiled brother's pardon. As Caesar considered the request, Caesar grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it down from his shoulders, the signal for the attack to begin. Casca struck first, stabbing at Caesar from behind, but his nerve failed and the wound was shallow. Caesar wheeled around, grabbing Casca's arm and stabbing him with his stylus, the pointed writing instrument every senator carried. For a moment, it seemed Caesar might fight his way free. At 56 years old and in failing health, he was still a formidable fighter. But then the other conspirators rushed in, surrounding him, stabbing with their daggers. Caesar fought back, trying to shield himself, striking at his attackers, but there were too many of them coming from all sides. The Senate chamber descended into chaos. Senators not involved in the plot fled in terror. Caesar stumbled, bleeding from multiple wounds. He remained silent until he saw Marcus Brutus among his attackers, the young man he had loved and protected, possibly his own son. According to some accounts, Caesar then spoke his last words, not the famous Latin phrase et tu, Brute, that Shakespeare would later write, but rather in Greek, kai su teknon, which means you too, child. The personal betrayal seemed to hurt more than the physical wounds. Caesar pulled his toga over his head, a final gesture of dignity, perhaps not wanting others to see his face as he died. He collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, as if the ghost of his defeated rival was witnessing his end. When they counted the wounds later, they found 23 stab wounds on his body. The doctors who examined the corpse said that only one wound, the second one to his chest, had been fatal. All the others were superficial or struck him after he was already dying. The conspirators had quite literally overkilled him, each wanting to share in the act, each wanting to say they had struck a blow for the Republic. The assassins ran through the streets of Rome afterward, their daggers still bloody, crying liberty, freedom. The tyrant is dead. They expected the people to rejoice, to thank them for restoring the Republic, to celebrate the death of a would-be king. They thought they would be hailed as heroes. Instead, they were met with shock and horror. The common people of Rome did not see liberators. They saw murderers who had killed their champion, the man who gave them grain and games and hope. They saw aristocrats who had slaughtered the one politician who cared about ordinary Romans. When the assassins tried to address the crowd, explaining their noble motives, the crowd shouted them down and threatened violence. The conspirators had made a fatal error in their planning. They had prepared meticulously for the assassination itself, but had no plan for afterward. They had assumed that killing Caesar would automatically restore the Republic, that the Senate would resume its traditional role, that everything would return to how it was before Caesar crossed the Rubicon. They were profoundly, tragically wrong. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and co-consul, seized control of the situation with brilliant political maneuvering. At Caesar's funeral, he delivered a masterpiece of rhetoric, praising Caesar's achievements, displaying his bloodied toga to the crowd, reading Caesar's will which left gardens and money to the people of Rome. The crowd, already mourning Caesar, was whipped into a frenzy of grief and rage. In the end, Caesar's heir Octavian would win those wars and become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Republic was gone forever, replaced by an empire that would last 500 years. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, and nothing could cross back. Was Caesar a hero or a villain, a liberator or a tyrant, a savior of the people or a destroyer of liberty? The question has been debated for 2,000 years, and no consensus has emerged. He was, perhaps, all of these things. A man of extraordinary talent and ambition who found himself in an impossible situation. A general who loved his soldiers and led them into civil war. A politician who championed the common people while destroying their democratic institutions. The Republic he invaded was already corrupt, already dying. The Senate he defied was already more interested in protecting aristocratic privilege than serving Roman citizens. The constitution he violated was already breaking under the weight of empire. But Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon made the collapse final and irreversible. He could have walked away, accepted exile or even death, and left the Republic to reform itself or die naturally. Instead, he chose to take power by force. That choice created the precedent that would haunt Rome forever. From that moment, every ambitious general knew that the army mattered more than the Senate. Loyalty to a commander trumped loyalty to the state. Military force could override constitutional authority. The lesson of the Rubicon was clear. If you have an army and are willing to use it, you can take power in Rome. Sulla had proven it once. Caesar proved it again. Future emperors would prove it over and over, each taking power through military might. But Caesar's legacy is more complex than simple tyranny. He showed that one person with vision and will could transform an entire civilization. His reforms improved the lives of millions. His conquests spread Roman culture across Europe. His writings preserved invaluable historical knowledge. The calendar you use today is Caesar's creation, modified but fundamentally the same. Many of our months still bear Roman names, with July named for Julius Caesar himself. His influence reaches across 2 millennia to touch your daily life. The phrase, crossing the Rubicon, has entered every major language as a metaphor for a point of no return, a decision that cannot be undone, a commitment that burns all bridges. It represents the moment when someone chooses action over safety, ambition over security. How many times have you faced your own Rubicon? A moment when you must choose between the safe path and the uncertain one, when you must decide whether to accept the world as it is or try to change it, when you must commit fully or not at all. Caesar's story resonates because we all face moments when we must choose. His crossing of the Rubicon was not just about Roman politics or military strategy. It was about human nature itself, about the willingness to risk everything for a vision of how things should be. He won his gamble. He invaded his own country and conquered it. He transformed the Roman world. He became a name that will be remembered as long as human civilization endures. But he also destroyed the Republic he claimed to be saving and died with 23 knife wounds. History has no simple lessons. Caesar's life offers no clear moral. He was neither purely good nor purely evil, neither entirely right nor entirely wrong. He was a human being making choices in impossible circumstances, and those choices shaped the world we live in today. The Republic ended at the Rubicon. The Empire began there too. Everything that came after, from Augustus to Constantine, from the Pax Romana to the fall of Rome, from the spread of Christianity to the foundation of Europe, traces back to that moment. One general, one river, one decision, and the world was never the same.